So as I mentioned several talks ago, we've got this pattern that we're going to be doing in this part of the semester where we'll be talking about an idea or a concept, like we talked about neuroplasticity, and then we looked at a case study, someone like Temple Grandin, who really utilized that notion of neuroplasticity. So just like in the last talk, we talked about this concept of introversion and quiet creativity. Is there a way you can use introversion as a springboard for creativity? And today we're going to be looking at a case study that fleshes that out, that lets us see how introversion can be applied as a tool for quiet creativity. And our case study today is Eleanor Roosevelt, incredibly remarkable and creative woman. So Eleanor Roosevelt was an incredibly shy child. She would have been, in the terms of the last couple of talks, she was a highly reactive child. Anything intense, upset her, and she tended to retreat and want to really spend time mostly alone. She was born into a very, very prominent and social family, however. The Roosevelts in New York, of course, this is the family of Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt. She's born into this wealthy, originally Dutch family in New York. So she's in a very prominent position. She has to be a part of this high society crowd. But she's a very, very shy child. So her mom is a socialite and the kind of doyenne of New York society. She's very beautiful, she's very charming, she's very outgoing, and she's pretty disappointed in her little girl, Eleanor. She had 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. She really doted on the boys, and they tended to be fairly extroverted, but she was not very happy with Eleanor, who was such a shy child. Also, Eleanor was kind of plain. And in her mother's world, a woman was meant to be attractive. And her mother was very attractive. So she's kind of disappointed in Eleanor, and she doesn't hide her disappointment. She tells Eleanor, you don't have any looks, so you better get good manners. And she calls Eleanor Granny. Because she thinks she's so kind of old-fashioned and not much fun. So it's a difficult relationship between Eleanor and her mother. On the other hand, her father just dotes on Eleanor, and Eleanor loves her father. Her father is Elliott Roosevelt. He was the brother of Teddy Roosevelt, and he was completely charmed by this little girl, this shy little girl. Unfortunately, her father had some real demons. He was a severe alcoholic. He was addicted to morphine. He was addicted to sex. He had many, many affairs. He got one of the servants pregnant, and she sued them for paternity. He was a crazy guy, and he led a very, very disturbed and violent life. He attempted suicide many times. He was a very, very troubled guy. So although Eleanor doted on her father, she realized there's something wrong. And yet, for her, he could do no wrong. He was this perfect dad. But it got very, very bad with Elliott Roosevelt, and eventually the family just sent him off to a mental institution in Paris and institutionalized him. And that got to be front page news in the newspapers in New York. He's drunk, he's an embarrassment, he's crazy, and he got sent to Paris in a mental institution. So he's separated from little Eleanor. And then, even worse, at age 8, her mother dies of diphtheria. And so that's a big sort of discombobulation of her life, she goes and lives with her grandmother, Mary Ludlow Hall. This was also a very prominent family and wealthy family. And so she moves from one prominent wealthy family, the Roosevelts, to another prominent wealthy family, the Halls. And her father is, out of the picture here pretty much. She gets letters from him and the occasional visit, but she's mostly being raised by the Hall family. And there are social obligations she has to do there. Then, within a year of her mother's death, then her father, in one of these drunken rages, he also dies. And so she's left at age 9, an orphan, both parents dead, living with her grandma, and shuttling back and forth between this huge mansion in Manhattan and their country home on the Hudson River in upstate New York. And in both places, there are big social obligations. What she really wants to do is be alone with her books and with her music and with her art. And she had an Aunt Bai. She would go over to Aunt Bai's house where there was a little sewing room, and Aunt Bai fixed up the sewing room so it could just be for Eleanor to have her space. And she loved nothing more than to just be there, be by herself with her books and with her music. That was heaven for her. She had this very rich life inside her head. She imagined things, she dreamed things. The books were a vehicle for taking her to other worlds and to other roles and other imaginings that were exciting to her. So she loved this kind of fantasy world in her head, but she did not like the life she had to live in a more public sense. Her grandmother expected her to come out at social occasions and not to be this droopy, quiet child, to, be assertive and speak up and have good manners. And so she learned to do that. She disciplined herself to be able to play that kind of social role, although she hated it. And it was very, very difficult for her. And she said, that was painful, all that discipline. But it helped me later on learn how to cope with situations that I had to deal with and were hard for me. But because I was brought up doing that, I knew I could do it. So difficult time growing up. At age 15, she's sent away to England to a finishing school. So these finishing schools were about teaching young ladies social graces. There was education involved in it too, but it was very much about how to be a good conversationalist. And this was, she went to a school called Allen Wood. The woman who ran it was Mademoiselle Souvestre, a French woman. And this was a fantastic thing for Eleanor. She and Mademoiselle Souvestre became very, very close. Mademoiselle Souvestre really loved Eleanor. And she really taught her to be interested in social issues. So in the conversation back at her grandma's house, it was all about this kind of narcissistic world, gossipy, who's doing what, who's got this money, who's got whatever. But at Mademoiselle Souvestre's school, she wants them to converse about art and about politics and about social issues of the day. And these are things that really interest Eleanor. Mademoiselle Souvestre also, because she was so fond of Eleanor, she helped her form friendships with the other girls. And she got some really good, tight girl-to-girl friendships at Allenwood, which was an all-girls school. So here was an opportunity for Eleanor to, in a way, come out of her shell and begin to interact with other people. So while Eleanor is at Allenwood School in England, her uncle Teddy gets elected President of the United States. So she's 16 years old. She's off in England. Uncle Teddy was her favorite uncle, and he was crazy about her as well. He kind of, I think, felt like he needed to make up for his jackass brother who had been a terrible father to Eleanor. And so he kind of paid particular attention to her. I thought she was amazingly smart and interesting as a person. So at age 17, she moves back to the United States with her uncle as president of the United States. She returns to living in New York. She's back in this social swirl, which she's not crazy about, but in order to please her grandma and her family, she puts up with it. But she also takes on some interests of her own. She begins to work at some of there were these kind of community centers that were there for immigrant families, helping them adjust to life in New York City. And these are disadvantaged people, and Eleanor's very interested in their plight, and she's kind of been the underdog herself, and she's got a lot of sympathy for the underdog, and so she starts doing volunteer work at some of these community centers. And she runs around with a crowd of people her age and runs into this guy, Franklin Roosevelt, who was her fifth cousin once removed, and who she had known in her childhood. Occasionally they'd end up in the same place, and even had seen a bit in her teen years. But then she really had never paid much attention to him, but they began to hang out together. They were friends, and then eventually they became more than friends. And after that, they actually married. So when she's 21 and he's 23, they get married. So people found them to be a really odd couple. Eleanor was very quiet. Eleanor was kind of plain. And Franklin was dynamic and charismatic and handsome, and went to Harvard, and he was just a very impressive guy. And it seemed kind of weird that he would want to marry Eleanor, who wasn't, it seemed, the same kind of person he was. But he saw the depth in Eleanor and her intelligence, but her shyness kind of kept that from being obvious to most people. So they get married, and from the very beginning, there's some issues in the marriage. They move in with his mom, Sarah Roosevelt. He was an only child. He's a very pampered only child. His mom is just, all over controlling the environment around him. So as Eleanor was fond of saying at that time, there were kind of three people in that marriage, she and Franklin and his mother, Sarah. They lived at her house in Hyde Park, this mansion up on the Hudson River. Finally, Eleanor just kind of couldn't take it anymore and said, I want you to build me a tiny little cottage on the estate here, but where I can live away from Sarah's big house. So it's a very odd arrangement, but they created this tiny little modest cottage called Valkill. And really, Eleanor spent most of her time on the estate at Hyde Park, but living in Valkill, this little cottage away from the big house. She and Franklin had 5 kids. That was taking a whole lot of her time in her 20s. She also, though, because she had some significant financial means, because both her father and her mother's family, there were inheritances that came to her. And she used the money to make some interesting investments. She started a girls' school, very much like Mademoiselle Sylvestre's school. She thought, why do people have to go to England to get that kind of education? And she taught at that school and had a significant emotional investment in that school. She also, because she was interested in the arts and she was interested in disadvantaged people, she got interested in folk arts or crafts in Appalachia, where people were very, very poor. And they had been very good craftsmen, and they made this beautiful furniture, but now industrialization had replaced that kind of handcrafted furniture. And so they were out of work and they were starving. So Eleanor started a little company in West Virginia where they made handcrafted furniture, and she sold it as a kind of premium thing. Look how beautifully crafted this is by human hands. And she had a little company that did that. So all through her 20s, she's having a really, really great life and being a creative person. Her husband, in the meantime, he's getting to be a very successful politician. He gets to be a congressman from New York, and then he gets to be Secretary of the Navy, and then he runs for Vice President of the United States. Very, very prominent, up-and-coming Democratic politician. And then right in the midst of that meteoric rise, he gets polio, and he's very, very, very ill. And for several years, he's out of the public spotlight, and he is actually not so much with the family, but he's getting therapy in Warm Springs in Georgia. And Eleanor is again sort of managing family life and the kids. And then in 1928, they convince him to run for governor of New York, and he comes out and exposes the fact that he's got polio, he's in a wheelchair, and makes a run for governor and becomes governor of New York. And then Eleanor is First Lady of New York. And then very shortly after that, in 1932, he runs for President of the United States, and Eleanor becomes First Lady of the United States. So these are big new challenges. So Eleanor Roosevelt is this quiet, shy woman who really likes being alone and having this life inside her head. But now, as First Lady, first of New York and then of the United States, she's thrust again into this very powerful social milieu, and everybody's focusing their attention on her, and she's expected to be, a leader, a charismatic person. So she's trying to figure out, what do I do with this role? And normally the first ladies are people who, they're very social, they're very gracious, they're worried about the clothes and about the decorations of the White House and about the table that's set for this eloquent banquet. These are things first ladies are supposed to do traditionally. But Eleanor Roosevelt, yeah, she could do those things, but she also really cared about a lot of other social issues she'd been exposed to in Mademoiselle Sylvestre's school. In her work in these community centers, she's gotten a lot of sympathy for disadvantaged people. In her work with the people in Appalachia who are out of work in the Depression and in dire poverty, she's very, very concerned about them. And she's trying to think, is there a role I can play as First Lady? Being the shy, quiet person I am, is there a role I could play in helping these people? And in fact, she became this amazing advocate for disadvantaged people. She really worked hard on issues of civil rights in the United States. She worked very hard on issues of human rights around the world. And as we'll see in the next talk, she was an amazingly creative person in really transforming the plight of disadvantaged people in many, many different contexts. And we're here on the UT campus by the statue of Dr. Martin Luther King. And Dr. Martin Luther King would have been a generation younger than Eleanor Roosevelt, but he was someone who knew her very well. And when he was a young civil rights advocate, Eleanor Roosevelt was up there as a leader advocating that the United States needed to pay more attention to civil rights. And even before that terminology was so common, and even before the generation of Dr. Martin Luther King, she's working with people like Thurgood Marshall and trying to get a better plight for African American people in the United States. So she was a real civil rights leader at the early stages of that movement in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Martin Luther King called her perhaps the greatest woman of our time. So, wait, how does this shy, reserved, plain girl turn into perhaps the greatest woman of our time and making this incredibly creative contribution to the social vision of what it is to be America in the 20th century? So in the next talk, we'll explore that a little more. But I think that's part of this notion of how do you use introspection? How do you use introversion and a kind of quiet creativity as a powerful force, as Eleanor Roosevelt shows us it can be done. Okay, see you next time.